Hi, I'm Rhaegar. This is You're Right, and it's RWBY Beyond Episode 2, A Knight's Journal. And starting off, when this was announced, I saw a lot of discussion about what RWBY Beyond is or is going to be. Because we only have a few episodes of it, and that Rooster Teeth shutdown is imminent. So I saw people disappointed that we were getting a Jaune thing. I also saw people confused that it wasn't something taking place on Remnant during the time of Volume 9, and is instead something, after the volume ends. And I think it's a really interesting discussion, and I'd like to raise some points that I saw online while we're talking about it. Is that one thing we have to remember is also who is available. So we don't know what voice actors are available to come back. That could be a huge reason for why we get what we get and what characters are there. We also have to remember that I think we're trying to leave ourselves in the best way possible, which doesn't mean answering every question, it also means teasing things for the future. And the best thing we could get out of each Beyond is at least some answers or some questions that are going to lead us forward in case there is any more. And I do think we got that here in an interesting and different way than the last one. And I also think that, honestly, at this point, there are some people who just will never like Jaune, who still, after 9 volumes, can't take on that Jaune is a main character. Not the main character, but one of them. But either way, it doesn't really matter. We have this, it's only a few minutes long, it's about Jaune returning, and I thought it was pretty interesting, so let's go through it. So, it starts, as you'd expect, with Jaune contemplating that he is both young and old, something that would mess with most people. It's a concept we all can't wrap our heads around. It's something we can think about, but in real life, no one has this experience. And that just the simple acknowledgement that things aren't the same. Not only are they in, the last remnants of humanity, the last holdout of humanity, but he isn't who he used to be. He has all these experiences and all this time, and he is both Jaune and the Rusted Knight. And despite saying he would rather forget, he can't. And he talks about what it's like being back, that Ren and Nora have their own thing. Which makes sense, there was time apart, and they had trauma, and they had, obviously, a bond anyway, so that acknowledgement that they've grown closer together, despite everything. And Jaune feels left out, it's like he missed chapters of this story at the same time, having it filled in with all these crazy things while he was alone. And I do think it's interesting, too, that when he talks about being with his team, that Oscar isn't included in that. And Oscar we'll get to later, but you have that separation where it really felt like Oscar was part of the team when Jaune fell. And now he's very much separate and taking on that Ozpin role almost. He's in those secret meetings and he's an authority figure there because there's Ozpin in there. So he's not part of the team. So that team is now just Jaune, Nora, and Ren, really. And Jaune can't relate. And as much as Nora's making jokes, he says, Nora likes to remind everyone about how I'm an old man, sort of thing. But it's a disconnect there. It's a real character piece there of how do you return to normal life? And then the life you're returning to is not normal anyway. You're, the warriors in the last holdout of man. So you're in a crazy spot. And that will come up later when he talks about the hope around campfires and things like that. So I do think it's a really well-structured few minutes, and it really leaves Jaune with that question, who is Jaune? Am I the Rusted Knight? Am I not? And he said, I feel out of place. Like, I left the time by, and it did the same. But just like with the last Beyond, the opening is sort of, it is our introduction, but it's not the meat of the thing. The meat of the thing is saying that he's been meeting with someone who he thinks could understand him, which is Oscar. But here's where we really get into, the conspiracy theory stuff, because there is just tons upon tons of signals that Oscar may be Lewis and not have said anything. And that really feels like where this is leading. And I know there's going to be people who disagree with that lens, but there's just foreshadowing in everything they talk about and do. Just like the last Beyond when I mentioned that I wouldn't normally think that Oscar would be on board with lying to people. I don't think he would. But there is so much more Ozpin than Oscar here. It was brought up in the epilogue that the merging is getting harder and harder to deny. And he straight up says, I've been subject of a few fairy tales myself. And Jaune has to stop and correct him. You mean Ozpin has? And he goes, oh, yeah, right. Like, they are so close to just being one person. And that may mean that some of the morals we apply to Oscar, that he wouldn't lie to Jaune, that he would tell him these things if he knew him, may not apply anymore, because he is literally confusing himself with Oz, and that means that we don't know how much Oz is holding back, how much he's in control and is controlling what is said and what even Oscar knows from his memory, sort of thing. To start off with, Oscar says you should think back on all the good times in the ever after to help you remember what it was all for. Not just focus on the positives, but, find where that motivation came from. And we get this lovely reminiscent scene where Jaune talks about feeling a bit special because he sort of knew the story before it happened. And that is a key point that we'll get back to. But he felt a little bit special that he knew those things, and that Alex and Lewis, getting to know them was great, and that they thought that his life was amazing, even though to him it was just his life. And he told them all the stories. And, a point, we get it confirmed, I don't remember if it was or not, that Alex and Lewis were from Vacuo before there was Wars and Huntsman. So I do think there are some conclusions you could draw about the fact that we're back in Vacuo, and that's where Lewis and Alex came from. Perhaps if you want to link them to the mysterious hooded figure, perhaps it's a descendant, something like that. All that could very well be true. But what I think is more interesting is that not only is Oscar prompting him to remember these good times and tell them to him, almost as if he might want to hear about them again, maybe, in quotes, but also it was his advice to make this journal. A journal to write down the good times, write down the memories, write down the stories, and process them. And then immediately in the story Jaune tells, he outright says that's exactly what Lewis was doing. That Lewis was sitting around the campfire with him in the ever after, writing in his journal, writing down all the stories that would eventually become the fairy tale.
It might be able to help you remember what it was all for. And rewrite the story in your own way.
Lewis writing everything down in his journal. The story he'd one day tell, to help lead my friends to me.
So you have Oz, Pin, saying, I've been part of a few fairy tales myself. Don't you mean Oz? Oh yeah. And then, maybe you should write this down in a journal, it might help. And then he flashes back and thinks, oh yeah, like Lewis was sitting around writing it in his journal. Like, there's direct comparisons there. And then you also have the line that it felt special and nice knowing the story before it happened. Which, if Lewis was Oz, is the same example, the same situation he would be in. That Lewis would know the story before it happened, aka knew where he would end up, knew what Ozpin would be, knew that he would meet Jaune, knew that everything Jaune told him would be coming in the future would be coming. And just there's three main links there that really have me thinking that that could be the case. Immediately in back-to-back scenes, you have references where they are doing what the other one says. It was nice knowing the story before it happened. And then there was all these questions like, why would Oz let Jaune into the school? He probably knew those papers were forged, and why does he trust him and all these things? Well, if he knew the story before it was going to happen, because he heard it as Lewis, and the way he did that was writing it in his journal. So now, meeting his friend Jaune all this time later, he tells him, hey, maybe you should write it in your journal. Just, I don't know, connections here, like the cogs are linking. But also, we have more to talk about. That's just, theoretical. But also, we have some really nice heartwarming stuff here where he talks about that being with Alex and Lewis felt like being with his team again. People who make you better than just what you are. Also, being with Alex and Lewis was like being with his team again, almost as if one of them will end up being in his team, like when, Oscar was part of his team. Anyway, doesn't matter. Point is that we have these lovely flashbacks, and obviously we do get a Pyrrha reference just to make everyone cry, because if you thought we were getting out of Beyond without seeing Pyrrha just one more time, I don't know what to tell you. But also, before we leave, we get this really nice introspective moment with Jaune that was really quite well acted, I have to say, where he sees the campfires all over Vacuo, all the people gathered who are linked together, trying to wonder what they're building, what they're saying, the hope they're trying to stifle, like, how are they getting on? All these little people who were like him in the ever after, who were just forming bonds and surviving around this campfire and not knowing what the future brings. Finding those connections that he's had throughout his life now. Not just with his team, but with Alex and Lewis, and then even with the paper people, and then even then coming back with all these people again, like meeting back with his team after all these years. He's had lots of connections, and lots of connections come and go. So his life is really all over the place, and putting himself in the shoes of those around him. Also people who don't have his experience, Say what you want about Jaune being useless sometimes or whatever. He's had way more combat experience and just everything experience than all of these people stuck around him. And he's still being a hero, and he says, "Am I the Rusted Knight?" He's still looking out for those people. He's still thinking about them and what they are going through. And that's what prompts him to ask, "Do you think we're going to make it?" He asks Oscar, or Ozpin, "Do you think we're going to make it?" And then, in an almost knowing way, he says, "Around that campfire, did it matter?" And that's a really interesting perspective, that you can't know if you're going to win. Despite knowing some of these stories in advance because of their experiences, you can't know the ultimate outcome, but it's the people around you that matter. It's the people around you that make you who you are and make you better than who you are. It's the people around you who link you all together and give you the experiences and give you the good times worth remembering, the things worth writing in your journal, the things worth reflecting on whether you're going to make it or not, because you're in the now. You can't affect the future in the moment. You can't do anything except be around the fire with ones you love, and hopefully that can lead Jaune to connect more, perhaps, with Ren and Nora, or reconnect. Again, more questions about Oz. There's so many little things there that just hint that that's what's going on. And if it is the case, it's Oz lying again, and that just hurts the soul. We do have cool little shout-outs to the Ever After, like talking about inventing weekdays when they went there. Didn't have one, so they just called it Splatter Day. And then every day was Splatter Day, and all the little quirky things that happened in the market. References to farmers, by the way. You can call it reaching or whatever, and I'm not saying it confirms anything, but the fact that when they went to the market with Lewis and Alex, the thing that they could buy were little farmers, and the one that we look at particularly is green, in the presence of, Lewis, and how the green little farmer boy he might become. I'm just saying, I picked up on that one too. But my biggest takeaway is that yes, there are all these hints, but even if that's not the case, I really enjoyed this episode. Even if it's got nothing to do with Ozpin, and none of that matters, or the mysterious cloaked person, or any of that. If it was just a reflection on Jaune, and maybe it's because I'm fully on board with Jaune as a main character, one of them, that I really like this introspection, especially because you're talking to someone with an experience like no one else. The only person who could possibly relate is Oz and or Salem, and they're way too far gone and on different levels for it to matter. And they're also not point of view characters we have very often. So having Jaune really reflect on this, even over just a few minutes, and also the fact that he's taking steps to better himself, and this may sound a little odd, but a little far-reaching, I guess, but I'm just thinking all the way back to when he refused to ask Pyrrha for help. Volume 1. And finally he found the value in doing that. And now, after coming back and having this traumatic experience and having all this life experience that he doesn't know what to do with, he actually made the effort to go find someone he thought could help with Ozpin Oscar, and asked for help, and is taking on board that help. And he's a little slow to start, he's a little, reluctant, because why wouldn't he be? It's a tough subject, but he's actively trying to better himself and seek those who can help him. And, after being alone for so long, and after being burned by, Alex and the cat, these connections, they're hard to make yourself do again, because this is years for him. And he's actively doing it, and that is some great character growth, just showing where he is, perhaps showing his maturity. It's really cool to see. So I really enjoyed this. I thought it was cool. Let me know your thoughts down below. Conspiracy theory, do you think that Ozpin is Lewis and is just not saying it? Do you think that perhaps the fact they're from Vacuo connects them to the mysterious hooded person? Do you think that this has any other implications that I missed? And what do you think of Jaune's growth as a character? Because I'm very curious to hear what everyone thought, because I thought there was quite a lot in this, and for something small, which is the aim of all these Beyonds, is that for something small we got a lot out of it. So I personally was very satisfied. But that's all from me. Until next time, my name is Rigo. Hope you have a wonderful day. And I hope I did alright.